This OTA does everything an OTA is supposed to do, with targeted nerfs to some of the most powerful cards in the current metagame, and buffs to some cards that I think are going to be pretty exciting to see. First up, Fenris Wolf going to 3-4. There is reasonable debate, and I think good points on both sides of the argument that blame Fenris Wolf for its current status in the metagame, and also the context of Cannonball Mercury and Shang-Chi for Fenris Wolf's current status in the metagame. I think largely the answer probably lies somewhere in the middle, but for those who blame Cannonball, don't worry, there's a nerf to that in this patch as well. We're just starting with Fenris Wolf. 3-4 means that it'll be a much less free inclusion in decks. And I think a lot of this, to me, is actually due to the fact that Stardust exists now. I think when Fenris Wolf was the only line of defense against things that were discarding, like Hela or the Agatha Ghost Rider decks with Redshift, or the mixtures of those things, it was much more important to the game that it be aggressively costed and statted, such that it was able to exist and be put into a lot of decks to reasonably check those cards. But in practice, that's just not what Fenris Wolf has been. It has not been a reasonably statted tech card that shows up to beat Hela and Agatha Ghost Rider. What it has been is a force multiplier with Shang-Chi and the new, I suppose, Cannonball Mercury combo, if you consider new to mean a few months old. That is the largest role that Fenris Wolf has occupied. And post-Stardust, there isn't even really that justification for it to be what it is, or as aggressively costed as what it is, because if you wanted to deal with those decks, you now have a much more powerful option at dealing with those decks. In other words, Fenris Wolf feels like it was a card that was created to do one thing, largely to combat the ability of self-discard decks to rule a metagame, failed at doing that, but gradually found a role as a force multiplier of these already powerful Shang-Chi and Cannonball type of cards. Now, what that means is that Fenris Wolf is probably due for this nerf. He no longer has the pressure on him that justifies his previous stat line, and in fact, his previous stat line has proven only to push him to a position where he is force multiplying cards that are very unfortunate and unfun necessarily to play against. Not that fun is like an objective measure or anything, but I think largely it's not a fulfilling play pattern to have your biggest thing blown up and then have your opponent get your biggest thing. That's a very straightforward thing. Even if we were thinking that that's like a cool thing to happen, which I kind of don't think it is, it has been demonstrably a little too strong. This is a very meaningful nerf to Fenris Wolf. Going from 2 to 3, it's not a death sentence, but it does mean that you really have to invest in this if you want to actually get the payoff. 3-4 is not bad, but a lot of what makes Fenris Wolf good is the relatively lower competition among 2-drops compared to the competition among 3-drops. They only just started making 2-4s with upside. Meanwhile, at 3s, you have 3-5s with upside, you have Gladiator, you have Cassandra Nova, a bunch of legitimately potentially lane-winning cards running around, which Fenris Wolf now has to compete with, as opposed to competing with the relatively lower power level, higher utility payoffs. Things like Kate Bishop and Merlin, you can argue, are stronger or as strong, but it's not nearly the same level of competition that this card will face at 3. This has been a linchpin of a ton of good stuff mid-range strategies, and so frankly, I'm just happy I'll be able to play some other kind of stuff now. Cannonball also eating a very fat nerf, going to 5-6, and I think there's something to be said about multiple potential approaches to a Cannonball nerf, because a lot of the time on social media, what I will see is approaches that are very A to B, a direct line, right? What is the problem with Cannonball Mercury? Well, the problem is that it works at all. So we have to make it not work, or we have to take away Mercury's move, or we have to do things of that nature. And because I'm not a card game designer, a lot of that stuff does kind of make sense to me. All of my solutions to stuff are just like, what is the problem? How do I fix it? And not really thinking about like, is this elegant design? What sort of trade-offs do we have to consider? And I get why they don't go that direction. When I look at this card, I think the positive case for taking Cannonball to 5-6 is it really does matter when you're not comboing off. And so this combined with the Fenris Wolf nerf does feel like a very large hit to a very powerful package. Those cards do go together. And so now you not only have a worse payoff in the form of Fenris Wolf, you have Cannonball Mercury itself being 2 points worse, meaning that if you are not actually doing something massive with the Cannonball Mercury Fenris Wolf, it's still going to be a little bit of a test or a stress on your resources when you aren't fully comboing off. Cannonball at 5'8 was just like a pretty damn solid card to play. At 5'6 is a lot less solid. You are giving up more in terms of opportunity cost to get the payoff that Cannonball Mercury represents when you run him as a 5'6. At a 5'8, he is just absolutely one of the best 5-drops that also has this upside built into him. And so I do think that there is something to be said for balancing in this way as opposed to balancing aimed specifically at the interaction between Cannonball and Mercury. Instead, this balance is aimed at the way in which these cards are allowed to have an opportunity cost. And I think that is a relatively reasonable thing to do. The negative or pessimist case on this is that Cannonball Mercury still exists. And even if there are going to be more opportunity costs paid for it, it will still be a thing that people will lose to. And there are generally, I think, there is some consensus in the Marvel Snap community that whenever your opponent interacts with you, it's like the worst thing that's ever happened. I think this is an appropriate way to balance it. I do wonder that if there was an easier way to solve the Cannonball Mercury issue without like fundamentally breaking the functionality of either Cannonball or Mercury, if they would have gone that direction. But largely every solution that I've seen and proposed to the Cannonball Mercury functionality does break one of the two cards. Like, what if we made Cannonball not target? Well, then what's the point of him? What if we made Mercury not move? What's the point of her? So I do think that this is probably the best option on the table given the context, but it is worth noting that this is a specific choice to nerf the potential opportunity cost of this card rather than nerfing the interaction itself. And I'm interested to see how it plays out, both in terms of how people react to it and in terms of how it meaningfully impacts the win rates of these cards. This is not the launching into the sun that I wanted of Juggernaut, but it is something at the very least. Juggernaut has been the scourge of high elo mid-range decks for forever, basically. I feel like I made a video somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 months ago asking them to 4-5 Juggernaut, and all the time that has happened between when I made that video and now has only made me harsher on this card. The fundamental issue that Juggernaut has is that it is effectively a cheap Alioth a lot of the time. Many games are decided by who has priority for Juggernaut and what lanes are we meant to target with it. And a lot of that is down to not just the actual effect that it has, but that the effect was costed as aggressively as it was. Having it be 3 in a world, especially where you can do so many powerful things on 3 or with 3 energy, means that you are very often able to win a lane with Juggernaut and then win a lane with some other stuff. Making him a 4-5 means that you have to go out of your way to get him back to 3. Let's say you're doing Zabu or Surge or whatever. It's still probably a very playable card, but it does mean that in the base use case, it is much worse unless you are playing 2 cost carries effectively. Now, there are decks that do that, right? You look at the like fully formed version of the Invisible Woman First Steps deck. I kind of think that's actually a place where Juggernaut is still quite good, right? Like, that is still a deck that is reasonably powerful. If I have one worry about this card right now, it's that 4-5 feels like 1 point of power too many for a card that is like this. Like, there are very thin margins on a card with this kind of text, and now you can play it in more lanes where it will win. And I think that that energy cost, that energy tax that they applied to it, while it does matter, the increased range of possibilities for this card, like it used to be if you were down 3 in a lane, that was not a good Juggernaut lane. Now you can be down 4 in a lane and it will be a good Juggernaut lane. And yes, it costs 4. I get that. But I would have been a lot less generous with the power that this card gets, given that the text that it has. I worry that this isn't enough of a nerf. I even worry that like on day one, a bunch of my friends are going to come back to me and say, haha, they buffed Juggernaut, right? Because it will feel better in the world where you are able to play it. And when you aren't able to play it, you're probably just retreating anyway. And so I do think there's going to be a bit of a perception gap relative to like how strong it actually is. I think this is probably still a pretty strong card, though. I realize 4 is a lot, but this is a world with Zabu in it. This is a world with Surge in it, and I do think there's going to be some exploration of that. I also think that Invisible and First Steps decks are incredibly well set up with their 2-cost carries to be very good at being Juggernaut decks in this new world. At the outset of the video, I said that I liked this patch, that I thought it was doing basically all the right things. This is the one area that I think this patch stumbles for me. And I can go into a couple of different reasons why. Fantasticar going to 4-5, I feel like, is an overreaction. My instinct is they looked at nerfing this like generic mid-range package and they were like, okay, what we don't want to do is have Fantasticar now be a very important part of the best deck that didn't get nerfed. So we're going to nerf Fantasticar. We're going to make sure Invisible Wind First Steps power stays down. What we're not going to do is go right back to Invisible Wind First Steps right after we just left the Invisible Wind First Steps meta. So from a practical standpoint, I kind of get it. On a personal level, I think this is an over nerf. And I understand, again, the context in which I am judging this to be an over nerf is a context in which we had 2-3 Fenris Wolf, 3-3 Juggernaut, and, 5-8 Cannonball, and that is the thing that I'm comparing it to. But I do kind of just want it to prove it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like this card needs to prove that it actually needs to go in that new context before they do what they did to it. And 4-5 is... that's a stringent nerf. Like, that's a lot, dude. Like, I mean, at least 4-6 it. I don't know. This is the one area of this where it's like, I don't feel particularly good about this change. And I don't want to get into like debates over the economy, because one of the things about every patch that I like in Marvel Snap is I evaluate these things from a balance standpoint, and then someone who's like, well, I spent X amount of money on this, and now I feel rug pulled. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that's Marvel Snap. They change the cards. That's like sort of the premise of the game, is like, if your card is too good, they will change it. And I think that that kind of thing, like, there's going to be someone getting mad at that sort of as like a free space on the bingo card, no matter what the actual balance changes are. But I do think that it is notable to me that I worry about the perception of this being similar to the perception of the Mr. Fantastic nerf. Because I think while everyone agreed Mr. Fantastic was a problem, I don't think everyone agrees that Fantasticar is a problem. Maybe I'm off base just because I don't agree that Fantasticar is a problem. But I do think that, like, okay, there is something fraught about nerfing a season pass card, or a super premium season pass card, or whatever you want to call it, right? There is something fraught about that I think the Mr. Fantastic nerf revealed. And I'm kind of wondering if this is like not just a misstep in my view in terms of like, I think they're probably over nerfing the deck, but also in terms of just like public perception. I don't really have a good gauge on the future, but as of the time I'm making this video, what I am worried about is that, like, what is largely a good patch will be sort of generally overwhelmed by various economic issues. Like, someone who just bought Fenris Wolf will be like, I can't believe they did this to me. Someone who just bought Fantasticar will be like, I can't believe they did this to me. And I get that that's a free space on the bingo card, but it does feel a little bit more salient for Fantasticar specifically. Mad Thinker is getting a point of power, which it probably desperately needed. I don't particularly think this is going to make Mad Thinker incredibly relevant, but it does go a long way towards making him way less garbage. And I think that's probably just a good thing to do. Mad Thinker at 1-2 is now much more on par with other things of the nature that he has. One of the worst parts about Mad Thinker is that because it's a cheap card, it can be very hard to get those early triggers on it. So just having it have that extra point of power does matter. It raises the floor in a very meaningful way. And when you have a card with a higher floor, it's just a lot harder for it to be actively bad and losing you games. Like, if you think back to stuff like Clea, where it's like, this is not a great card, but one-drops are so mediocre, and there are no other one-drops in the space that this card is trying to do. At least now Mad Thinker gets to, like, reasonably make a claim that this is a card that you can consider to put in your deck, as opposed to just being kind of a running joke. This guy at 1/1 is not meaningfully different from this guy at 1/2, except for the fact that it is now on par with the other very mediocre ones that you would very often consider running in whatever deck you're trying to play. I think he'll probably be a reasonably okay inclusion in whatever deck wants to play him and wants to build for him. I don't think that deck is going to be meaningfully good or anything, but you can absolutely slap a Mad Thinker in your Victoria hand deck, feel less embarrassed about it. You could slap a Mad Thinker in like a super giant version of a Devil Dinosaur deck, feel less embarrassed about it. You're absolutely allowed to do those things. You were allowed to do them before. I actually have a 60% win rate with Mad Thinker over like 20 games, but I was very much just putting him in decks that were good, and I only played 20 games, and that should really tell you like what exactly this card is. Putting it to 1/2 brings it up to the baseline. I don't think it necessarily makes it an incredibly powerful addition to anything, although it is such a unique effect that if something ever does come out that makes this legitimately powerful, you are going to feel really, really, really good about the way Mad Thinker works. I might get killed for this, but I think this is an awesome buff. Nightmare going to 3/1 from 3-1. One of the things that really struck me about Nightmare's release was just how much people seemed to love playing the card. This is a card that was exciting and awesome and was kind of its own archetype. I have long advocated for buffing cards like this, buffing cards like Dormammu, buffing cards that give a deck an identity to build around. And I think Nightmare decks as a thing are something that is not necessarily something I want to be playing against all of the time. I'll be 100% honest about that. I would have rather buffed like Dormammu or other cards from that set, but I do think that Nightmare was the card of that cohort that had the most, I guess, thematic resonance. People love playing Nightmare. People have a ton of fun playing it. What I do worry about, and I think this is a reasonable worry, is if this deck ever gets legitimately too popular, it could become very difficult to play around, especially at higher levels. Like, obviously, one of the things that people really don't like about RSM is that you can't really have an idea of what you're trying to deal with here. And I think anyone who's ever been Infinite Galactist off of a Nightmare kind of knows what the range is, and the range is roughly infinite. There's only so many things you can play around. It gives the Nightmare player massive snap equity. And so if this deck gets to like a legitimately good win rate, I think it'll become a very big threat in terms of cube rate. And I'm not exactly sure what to do to go about countering this kind of stuff, other than like, if everyone's playing Nightmare, just play some combo deck that goes over the top of them. That's largely the way I've found to answer them, because instead of like trying to be like, oh, I'm going to Shang-Chi them, which also probably works, you could just like play Kid Omega or whatever and just be like, yeah, okay, nice deck. None of it matters. I have way more points than you. I don't care what your cards say. It's actually 100% over. That kind of stuff is sort of what I think of when I think of countering Nightmare, and it's not the most fun thing to be in a metagame of that, and Nightmare would be my guess. So I sort of hope that this isn't as big of a buff as it looks like, but I think Nightmare was already pretty close to playable, and they are making it legitimately an option worth considering. I do think Nightmare has some fundamental limitations, but it does strike me as the kind of like card that will be more powerful at high elo where things are confusing and ranges are estimated much more reasonably. So a card that breaks range estimation is much more powerful. I think that this is a generally good decision. I just wouldn't have chosen this specific card to buff, but I totally understand why they would. Because of the cards released in probably the last 3 months, this is the one that I think has resonated with the most people relative to its power level. So taking a card that I think a lot of people really enjoy and saying, let's just make it stronger, I do think that's a good thing to do. I would have done it to Dormammu first, but I guess they technically did that last patch, even though for some unbelievable reason, I'm still mad about this. They buffed Dormammu's spell and then took a point of power off of him, and it's just like, what is even the point of that? Like, oh, the 11th power is really going to break Dormammu. Anyway, I do think that this is, to me, and I feel like this is the kind of thing that, like, it'll get clipped and then played in slow motion when I'm mad about this card in 2 weeks. This is probably the highlight of the patch for me. I don't want patches to just be nerfing stuff. I want patches to be buffs, but more than that, I want them to be meaningful buffs to cards people like that are resonant and have decks that create identity around them. And Nightmare definitely does do that. Cannonball going to 3-5 is a choice that will no doubt have 10 million comments about the economic implications that I'm basically going to totally ignore here because I just don't want to talk about that. That's kind of like its own video if I want to do that. So 3-5 Cannonball is suddenly kind of an insane Iron Patriot Gwenpool card. And this has previously been a little bit not great. But we also just had the mid-range core of the last 4 weeks basically completely hammered with a baseball bat and a nail through it. Not only are Fenris Wolf and Cannonball worse, we also had nerfs to the Invisible Woman package in the form of Mr. Fantastic and Fantasticar, and Havoc, and that has... I think there is a very strong possibility that that leaves us with Iron Patriot Gwenpool and then this card as a potential mid-range package du jour. I don't necessarily know if that is a fact, but I do know that at 3-5, this card is very compelling to me. It's not going to be the world's most powerful thing, I think, but there is a very real chance that she ends up as a very important piece of a lot of different stuff. Now, as I say this, I want to remind everyone, I said I wouldn't talk about the economic implications. This card is going into packs at the end of the season. That is very, very close to now, okay? This is probably the right time to buff it if they are going to buff it, largely because it doesn't actually force you to go and buy the card for the $20 on the season pass. So I will say that much at the very least. America Chavez buffed to +3 power. I basically have nothing to say about this except exactly what I said about Mad Thinker, which is card exists within a very specific niche. It is a 1/2 with some meaningful upside. +3 power does seem pretty compelling. Not being able to choose what the +3 power goes on as opposed to, say, Agony is relevant, but the upside of this card is much larger. I would not be surprised to see America Chavez being a fairly generically played card, but I would also not be surprised to see her not actually make that difference. This does effectively represent 1/5 in stats, but a lot of the utility of ones is that they are often easy to play alongside other cards, making it more important to actually realize their gains. This is part of why Hydra Bob is a legitimately competent 1-drop a lot of the time, because his gains are fully realized no matter what turn you play him on, and it's very easy to do 5+1 or 4+1+1 in the case of, say, Hydra Bob, Miles Morales, and a waived Magneto. That kind of stuff is much easier to make sense with Hydra Bob than it is with an America Chavez, who needs to actually realize her gains by having the card that she buffs actually be played. So I think it's possible that this is just, wow, look at all the great value we get out of this. 1/5, that's awesome. Good card to curve out. But it's also entirely possible that the problems she has with realizing her power leave her still in the Mad Thinker camp of 1-drops as opposed to the Hydra Bob camp of 1-drop. Last up is Ghost Spider at 1/3, and I'm not going to say I think this goes in everything, but I do think I'm going to lose to a bunch of decks that are playing a random Ghost Spider. This is a wildly powerful effect if you are able to generically justify it, and at 1/3 I think you are much more able to generically justify it. Now, it is a wildly powerful effect mostly in context. It's not adding power to your board, it's making your board more confusing and harder to play around. That kind of stuff is strong. Like, you think about this in terms of a buff to move decks, and I don't know that it's actually meaningful there, but I do think it's probably pretty meaningful in decks like Red Wing, where you're playing like one big guy and then a couple of small guys. That kind of stuff is where 1 point really edges out and starts to really matter, I think. And I also kind of am interested in just like, what if I just put this card in my deck? Downsides are that it's pretty much not good on turns that are not 6. But I do kind of wonder, like, how good free rolling this is. You aren't going to be free rolling it. It is a slot in your deck, but it is just a kind of nice effect for a lot of decks to have access to. And at 1/3, I can kind of see, like, okay, I was playing Hydra Bob. I'll try this. Let's see how it goes. Let's see what ends up actually happening. I worry that it might screw you over a couple of the, like, sometimes, but honestly, this seems to me like a pretty strong effect, and I do expect to lose to, like, you know, full power redistribution on the final turn of the game that I didn't fully play around for 1 energy. That kind of stuff does seem very possible to me. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching this video. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Let me know what you think of this patch in the comments. I still read all of them. Thank you again for making it this far in the video. Have a wonderful patch day.